Well, for the next 5 weeks, we are going to be talking about generosity. And I know that when we talk about generosity, is that typically it's always connected to money, right? And as we talk about generosity, what I want you to know is that yes, money is an indicator, but it's not the only indicator, right? Is that as we talk about generosity, is this idea that you can be generous with lots of things, with your money, but you can be generous with your time. You can be generous with your energy. You can be generous with your intellect. You can be generous with your training and expertise. I was just thinking about this, preparing for this message, is that we have people in this church when 3 years ago, when all of a sudden, like overnight, we needed to figure out how to get online and stream. We had a group of people that were very generous with their time and their training and their experience. They're like, yeah, we kind of know how to do some of this stuff. I'm like, oh my gosh. And for a lot of you who are like, oh, that was super easy. I just clicked a link and the service popped up. There was a lot of people because you had benefited from their generosity. Right, and it could go on with other stories, and so it's not just a money thing. It is a time thing. It's this holistic thing, and so a lot of times it can be simple just to boil it down to money. But it doesn't include money. But at the end of the day, the money is a resource. Like your time is a resource, like your energy is a resource. God has gifted us differently with different intellect or different experiences or different trainings or different education levels. And the idea is that though we're generous with all of them. And so this generosity is not limited to money, but it does include money. And the reason why I say that is because sometimes it can be limited to that. But then sometimes it's also then eliminated. But it does include money. And it's funny because when we talk about money, that's when it gets a little dicey, right? I could talk about being generous with your time, like, oh, yeah, generous with my time, yeah, that'd be good. Generous with your energy, oh, yeah, I can be generous with my energy. But we talk about them being generous with your money. It's like, whoa, okay, hold on. Like, how generous do you mean, right? And that's where you go, oh, we touched a nerve. And I was thinking about like when I do any sort of counseling, when I'm talking with somebody, when I say, well, tell me about your relationship with your kids. And like, oh, I love my kids. Kids are great. That's wonderful. They're doing this, that. I'm like, oh, great. Tell me the relationship with your spouse. Oh, my spouse, he's great or she's great, and really serves me well. Okay, tell me about the relationship with your boss. Oh, I love the place that I work. That's great. That's wonderful. Great. Tell me the relationship about your mom. Nope. I don't want to talk about that. And as a counselor, guess what I want to do? That's the very thing I want to talk about. Like, oh, okay, we don't have issues over here. But all of a sudden, when we get here, we touched a nerve. And one of the jobs of a counselor, whether you know this or not, is just to go like this. We're just going to poke this and see what happens. We're gonna stick our finger a little bit carefully into the wound. And so I think that sometimes that happens with money, right? It gets a little touchy. I go, yeah, that's actually a little bit why we need to lean into it. And I think that there's two great dangers when there's talking about money. Is that one is that I know that when we talk about money, there's sometimes people go, the church always talks about money. All the church wants is my money. And I'm not sure of your prior experiences with churches, but that is not us. Actually, we rarely talk about it. And if you don't believe me on that, I dare you. You go listen to a year's worth of sermons. I dare you to go listen to a year. Call me on this. You go listen to a year's worth of sermons, and what you'd find is that we don't talk about it much. The other danger is that we don't. So the danger is that you go, oh, this is all the church talks about. That's all they care about is my money. No, the other danger is that you never talk about it. Right? We never bring it up. The problem is that Jesus brings it up. The Bible brings it up. Jesus says very bold claims like you cannot serve both God and money. You can't do both. Are you following God? Are you following money? Are you only following God if he leads you to more money? And so money, although like I said, we have lots of resources, money seems to be in this different camp. And so where generosity isn't directly tied to money, it's directly tied to money, but it's not limited to money. Not all people who give are generous. Just because people give money does not mean that they're generous. Not all people who give are generous. But I know this to be true, that all generous people give, right? So not everyone that gives is generous, but everybody who is generous, they give money. And where I do want to say it up front, especially maybe your past experience with churches and talking about things like generosity and money, is I want you to know two things. One, we're not trying to build anything, just FYI. Like, and by the way, we've got a building campaign. Not that that's a bad thing. That's not like, we're not leading into anything like that. So if you're like, okay, he's leading it into a building. Nope. And as far as I know, we're not in any sort of financial crisis. So there's not those things are happening. Because what I want at the end of the day for us individually and as a community, I want God to be crafting us and molding us as generous people, as a generous organization, as a generous community. In fact, some of you guys know I started leading our Northern California, Nevada churches, and somebody had asked, like, what's one of your goals? So one of my goals is that in like years' times we would be known as one of the most generous organizations around. That we would be generous with our time, our energy, our money, with our experiences as leading churches. We want to be known as generous. And as a community, that's what I want for us. I want us to be known as a generous community. And so in doing that, we're going to be looking at this conversation, this letter that Paul wrote to a church in Macedonia. Now, Paul wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians. When we think about the church in Macedonia, he's going to use this church. So he's writing to the church in Corinth for a second time. Well, at least the second time that we have recorded. Probably more than that, but the second time that we have recorded. He's going to use the churches in Macedonia, to encourage them to give towards a gift that was going to go to the church in Jerusalem. So there's been a collection for the church in Jerusalem from the churches in Macedonia that Paul had planted, and now Paul's going to use them as an example and as an encouragement to the church in Corinth to take part of the same sort of work. Now Paul and his team, they ended up in Macedonia. That was not their plan. Their plan was to go to Asia, and as they kept on wanting to go to Asia, it just says that the Spirit of Jesus kept them from going to Asia. So it's one of these places where you should pray all the time. God, like, here's what I would like to do, but if this is not of you, frustrate my ways. And so Paul and his team tried to go to Asia. The Spirit of God said no and kept on frustrating their ways. We don't know what happened, but the door was closed. And then Paul gets this vision of a Macedonian man who says, come to us. Come to us. And so Paul says, I think we should go to Macedonia. And so they do. So the churches that you would maybe know of or heard of that they would have visited and helped plant would have been the church in Philippi or the Philippians, the church in Thessalonica or in the Thessalonians, the church in Berea. So they planted us. When they went to Philippi, they showed up there, and Paul did what he always does, which is he starts preaching the gospel. And in preaching the gospel, there was a spirit of divination, a slave girl that was following them around. And really, it was kind of interesting because it says that Paul had casted out the spirit of divination just for the reason it just kept on annoying him. And so then, when the owners of her saw that she was freed and could no longer profit off her, they had Paul thrown into jail. That night when Paul was thrown into jail, the doors, it seems like through some sort of like provision of God, the doors of the jails were opened up. Then the jailer woke up and saw all of the cell doors were open, and is going to commit suicide because he knows that all of the prisoners will be gone, and he's responsible for them. So they're going to execute him. Instead of executing him, he's like, I'll just kill myself. But Paul says, whoa, 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 whoa. Actually, we're all here. We didn't go anywhere. And so a lot happened in these churches, and now Paul is going to write to them, and he's going to encourage them to follow him. Now, the church in Corinth, Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, the first letter to the church in Corinth, and he's trying to get them to embrace him because they had rejected him. And by the way, the church in Corinth was a total train wreck. And so Paul had lots of hard things to say. You can read 1 Corinthians, lots of hard things to say, and they rejected the letter. So Paul sent this letter, said, hey, you guys should stop doing these things. And they said, we don't need to listen to Paul, we listen to somebody else. So Paul pays them a visit. He calls it the painful visit. Pays them a visit. And after the painful visit, some of them repent. Some of them turn to, and some of them don't. And what you see in 2 Corinthians, actually the first part of 2 Corinthians, is him addressing the church that has turned around, has repented. And then the last part of 2 Corinthians is an addressing of the church that has not repented, has not turned around. And in the middle, we see this section where Paul is encouraging the church in Corinth to give to this offering that's going into Jerusalem. And so we're going to be looking at this, and I think the question that arises when we think about generosity, and as we think about this passage, as we're going to spend 5 weeks in 8 and 9, is then, like, how do you know if you're generous? I think that's the question. If all people who are give aren't all generous, then how do I know? When does giving become generous? And this morning I'm going to give you actually seven actually, as we see from the text, 7 things that I think here are 7 things, 7 ways to tell how is my giving as generous. Now, I think that a lot of times what we want is we want sort of more of a rubric. Now, here's one thing that you can know. If you don't give it all of your time, energy, money, intellect, you are not generous. That's a good way to indicate, right? I don't really give anything. Then you are not generous, because all generous people give. So if you're thinking, I don't give at all, like anything to anything, anybody, then you're not generous. But if you are giving of your time, energy, money, resources, your intellect, like relationally, like how do you know that it's generous? I think that's what most people want to know. Like, if I give $500, is that generous? No. But what if it's $501? Is it yes? Then I will give the extra dollar. We want to be known as generous people, but how do we know this? So, if you got your Bibles, let's jump into the middle of a conversation in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. We're going to go verse 1. We're going to go down through 7 this morning. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. Remember, that's the church of Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. Let me read that again. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed into a wealth of generosity on their part. And so Paul is writing to them, and as you said, like I said, like a lot has happened in Macedonia. Right? I mean, Paul's been arrested. Like he knows these people, and now he's using them as an encouragement to the people in Corinth. And what do we know about this church? I mean, just from what Paul has written here. Well, we know that they are experiencing, right, hardship, joy, poverty, and what else does it say? And extreme generosity. This hardship, joy, poverty, generosity. And it's weird because we go, that sounds really weird. Extreme hardship, joy, extreme poverty, generosity. Right? Maybe Paul meant like, maybe he meant to say they're not experiencing hardship, they're experiencing joy. They're not experiencing poverty, they're experiencing overwhelming generosity. Maybe that's not what he meant to say. He meant to say hardship plus joy right, plus poverty equals generosity. Like, what kind of math is that? That's some crazy math. Now, you would get how maybe how hardship, right, and poverty would go together. If you've ever been impoverished, or if you are impoverished, you know that hardship and poverty a lot of times and hardship go together. Sometimes you hear the young couples will talk about, oh man, when we started out, we had nothing, and they'll tell you about all the hardships. You get how this life is harder when there's not money. And actually, for a lot of these churches in Macedonia, actually what was happening is that their hardship and poverty were actually tied directly to their relationship with Jesus. That as they became Christians, they were experiencing, they were being ostracized, they were being marginalized socially. And anytime you're sort of marginalized socially, there's economic consequences to that. And so most likely this is what's happening to the church, is that there is this experiencing of this marginalization socially that's flowing over and causing some financial problems for them. It's one of those things that's interesting because I think a lot of Christians right now are afraid. They go, Josh, I feel like Christians are being pushed out to the sides. Oh, whatever will we do? And I'm afraid that if socially we are pushed out to the sides, that will cost us economically. Maybe I don't get the job. Maybe I lose the business. I go, yeah. You think that we're the first Christians? First of all, we're not even dealing with that yet. It's the potential of dealing with that. They are not dealing with the potential of that. They are dealing with the reality of that. And so I think, one, I understand the fear, but know this: we have nothing to fear. Because what is Paul just said about this church? This church is experiencing hardship, joy, and extreme poverty. It would be just one thing just to be like, oh, it's just poverty. But then to qualify that, to be like this is like, actually there's poverty, and then there's what they're experiencing, which is extreme poverty. And so we see this connection between affliction and poverty. And though at the end of the day, that generosity, though, is more about your character than it is about your circumstances. This word that we see here, the term for generosity, is actually only used 7 times in the New Testament. 3 of the times that it's used, 4 of them it's actually translated as generosity, but 3 of the times that it's used is translated as not generosity, but sincerity. And actually sincerity directly connected to their Christian faith. In other words, this idea that the generosity is being translated as sincere to Christ. In other words, when you act this way, there's something about you that's inside of you that is actually being consistent and congruent with your faith. That actually generosity is this outpouring of who you are in Christ. That generosity is not just something you do, but it's about who you are. And here's the beautiful thing. We all want to be seen as generous people, do we not? We just came out of Christmas. Other than the Grinch, he is not generous. Who's one of the great villains of Christmas? Scrooge? Greedy Scrooge? Will he learn what? That life is not about greed, that life is about generosity? See, we want to be seen as generous people, and here's the danger of generosity. We think that if I had different circumstances, then I would be a more generous person. You do this, I do this, we do this all of the time. Oh man, if I had more time in the day, I would be more generous. If I had more money in the bank account, I would be more generous. If I was more rested, I would be more generous. I would. If circumstances were different, I would be generous. Generous is not a problem of character, Josh. It's a problem of my circumstances. I go, no, it's not. It's like this. It's like the person that says, yeah, no, because if I won, like there's with the Powerball is like at $1 billion or whatever it is. Oh, $1 billion. Okay, so I'm going to take that. I'm going to walk away with $500 million. Josh, you know what I would do with that $500 million? I'm like, what would you do? I'd be generous. I would be generous. I would give away half it, $250 million. And maybe that's actually even the deal you made with God. God, if you just magically, supernaturally give me the numbers and I win that money, I'll tell you what, God, I'm going to be super generous with it. I'm going to give away $250 million, God, of it, the money. And I go, so you think that's generous? Yeah, oh, yeah. I mean, have you heard of such a thing? No, I haven't. But my question is, if you're so generous, what's happening with the other $250 million? Oh, well, I'll keep that. Yeah, no, that's totally gonna be mine. I'll keep that. I'll do other things with that. I go, you're no more generous than you were than before. You're not more generous because now you have more money. And actually, I would say maybe you're even less generous. Now you're hoarding $250 million. You weren't doing that before. See, we all have this idea that given different circumstances, we would be more generous people. But the problem the Bible keeps on coming about is that generosity is not about circumstances. Generosity is about character. And what we see here is that we see this here with this church. The generosity of this church is we think that generosity will be brought about when there's a change in our circumstances. The Bible keeps on saying, no, generosity will be brought about when there's a change in your heart. There's one other place I want to take you other than 2 Corinthians this morning. This is in Mark chapter 12, where Jesus actually says something very similar when he talks about generosity and giving. This is in Mark chapter 12, verse 41. And he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. This is referring to Jesus. Many rich people put in large sums. And a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples and said to him and said to them, truly I say to you, the poor widow has put in more than all of those who are contributing to the offering box. For they are contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, and she had all to live on. And so here we see again 2 totally different circumstances. And you would think the one that gave more would be, oh, they're the generous person. Jesus saying, no, 2 totally different circumstances, and also 2 totally different characters. It's the widow who's seen as generous. These are the rich people that are dumping in buckets of cash. They see themselves as generous, but I do not see them as generous. I'll tell you who's generous. This widow who gave everything that she had. She's the generous one. And so we see this generosity. And so when we think about true generosity, how do I know that if it's generous? What he says here is that there's this result in joy. Whenever there's generosity, how do I know it's giving? And how do I know it's generosity and not just giving? I go, well, one of the things is that there's joy. Like we celebrated Christmas and this idea of giving, and there's this idea of the joy that goes with the giving. Now, there's some of you that would give begrudgingly. Maybe sometimes parents will give begrudgingly. Okay. You're lucky I'm so generous. That doesn't sound like generosity, Mom. That does not sound like generosity, Dad. You're lucky. I'm so, No. True generosity has this joy. The most generous people that I know, when they give with joy. Now, later on, Paul's going to say this, when John preaches, it's going to be that God loves a cheerful giver. There's something about giving and joy, generosity and joy, that when you give with joy, that brings about this idea of generosity. And by the way, there's lots of emotions that people will elicit to give. I was thinking about that, where the Bible uses joy. We're going to use joy to encourage you to give. But people use all sorts of other things. I was thinking that this week is that there's a lot of giving that's motivated by fear. If you don't give, let me tell you, doom awaits. The church has used that for sure. We just came off a political season. Hey, if you give to this campaign, if you don't give to our campaign, if you don't give, we're going to lose. And if we lose, then it's over. It's over. That's a giving motivated by fear. And the only reason you give is to feel safe. But then there's this giving motivated by guilt. Right? Oh, if you care, then you'll give. But if you don't care, then just don't give. That's fine. Yeah. This is a giving motivated by guilt. The church has certainly used that. But then you give, the only reason you give is to feel justified. I did something. I'm good now. I gave. Yeah. I gave like $10. I'm solid. I don't have to feel guilty about that anymore. There is sometimes the giving that's motivated by duty. You give, and all you want to do is just it's your job to give. You're supposed to give, but then that's not generosity. You're just giving so that you would feel faithful. And sometimes people, in the most upside down of them all, they motivate you to give through greed. If you give, you'll get more. And sometimes the church has been very guilty of this. The reason why you don't have is because you don't give. And if you give, then you will get. And I go, that's garbage. That is a giving that's motivated by greed. And I'll tell you what it will do. It will not cultivate generosity in the giver. What it's going to cultivate in the giver is just greed. Greed in the people that are asking, and greed in the people that are giving. And by the way, we don't see Paul say this. Paul doesn't say, and they gave in their extreme poverty, and guess what? They bought a yacht. They got a yacht now, so look at this. And we would understand that they gave, and they were still experiencing extreme poverty. That was the crazy thing. And so that there's this joy. That generosity, how do you know that it's generosity and not just giving? That there's this joy. Then he goes on, look at verse 3 in chapter 8. For they gave according to their means, and as I can testify, beyond their means, of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this was not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord and then by the will of God to us. Let me read that part again. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means, and their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this is not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord and then by the will of God to us. And so I see this as that generosity is extravagant. They gave beyond. Did you see that? That generosity, how do I know that it's giving and it's not just, it's giving, but generous, not just giving? I go, well, one of the things is you see that it's extravagant. We say we didn't even expect this. I think a lot of times people are like, how much, what's the bare minimum I have to give to be considered generous? You go, that is not the question that generosity asked. What's the minimum? So I want to know if generosity is a range, from $1 to $200, super generous. Good. $100. That's how it is. I want to, what's the threshold? Generosity does not ask that question. What's the bare minimum? He said they're extreme poverty. They gave their own card. They gave according to their means, and then what did they do? They went beyond that. You think about the most generous people that you know, the most generous people you know. I will tell you this, rarely will you find them ever giving, in any stretch of the imagination, of any of their resources, the bare minimum. Their time. They're always generous with their time. Yeah, they're not thinking okay, how much longer? An hour, really? That the generosity is extravagant. Another one is that generosity is proactive and voluntary. They gave of their own accord. Did you know that none of you in this room feel super generous when you pay your taxes, right? You don't wake up January 1 thinking like, oh yeah, it's tax season now. Oh yeah, we got to write that check. We got to write that check. And the only reason some of you would file your taxes super fast is so you could get your money back. But if you're like, if I owe the government, like, yeah, no, wait on that, right? No, why? It's not generous because it's not voluntary. Although for a lot of us, it's the largest way that we give ever in any way. It's the money that we would give to the government. Doesn't feel like generosity. Why? Because it's not of your own accord. It's not voluntary. We should pay them. It's what Jesus says we should pay them, but it's not voluntary. Generosity, not only is it proactive, but generosity is also eager. This way he says, they were begging us. This church in extreme poverty that was going to send this gift to Jerusalem, where they were experiencing poverty and famine there, they're begging us. Please, would you take our money? Please, would you send this to the church in Jerusalem? Please let us help out. Please let us be a part. That the generosity is eager, that generosity is seen as a grace more than it is an obligation. This is what it says here, is that the favor of generosity. Do you ever see generosity as a favor? Did you know that the most generous people that I know, when they're generous towards me, they also seem as if I'm doing them some sort of favor? It's like, what are you talking about? Like, oh, thanks, Josh, for letting me help out. Like, wait, no, like thank you. But the most generous people I know, they have this disposition, their character is that when they give, it's as if you're doing them a favor. Thanks for letting me serve. Thanks for letting me help out. Yeah, okay. Like that's what it sounds like. And then we see this, that generosity sees a world beyond their own needs. This is a church in extreme poverty looking to give to another church in Jerusalem in extreme poverty. Do you know how easy it would have been for them, for Paul to say, hey, we're taking this collection for the church in Jerusalem. They're experiencing famine there now. Okay, Paul, okay. Oh yeah, fine. What about us? Where's our collection? Who are you collecting for us? I mean, it is so easy. As Paul's saying, they're experiencing hardship and extreme poverty. It would have been so easy for them to go, what about us, Paul? Who are you getting for us? But actually, what generosity does is generosity sees a world beyond your own needs. See, one of the reasons why we're not generous is because we're waiting for all of our needs to be met. And then in the overflow of all of our needs being met, we can then meet the needs of other people. The problem is that your needs are never met. Well, isn't it right? Just a little bit more, just a little bit more, just a little bit more. If I had just a little bit more time, Josh, a little bit more money, a little bit more energy, then I can love myself first, take care of myself first, take care of my family first, take care of all my needs first, and then I will be generous. Well, you may give, but that's not what generosity says. Generosity sees a world beyond its own needs. Very interesting. We live in a very transactional world, and increasingly so. If I give, I get. If I give, I get. And by the way, this is happening now, even, you hear this all the time now, more and more, in relationships. I'm in this relationship as long as the transactions work for me. And once the transactions stop working for me, I am out of this relationship. That's true of marriages. That's true of friendships. That's true in churches. That's true in workplaces. And so generosity actually says, no, actually, I'm going to give in a way that actually it goes even beyond my own needs. I see more in here than just what I get out of this. And so if all you're doing is to give so that your needs are met later on, that's not generosity. And sometimes you'll do this with God, like, God, okay, so if I give you what you want, then you will give me what I want. I will go to church for like a month straight. Just give me what I want, right? I will help people. I will give to your cause. Just give me what I want. And I go, that's transactional. God is not, in that sense, he's not transactional in that sense. And that's not generosity. You know, people will give as a means of getting publicity, right? I go, you're giving, but what are you getting in return? Publicity. It's not generosity. It is true generosity, Josh. I mean, did you see the size of the check? The thing was huge. I go, yeah, but you did that for the photo op, which is not, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's not generosity. Because you're giving, and in return, what you're receiving is publicity. Sometimes people will give money so that they can receive power and influence in return. They'll even be excited about how much money they're giving. I go, yeah, but you're only doing that because you want the power and influence that you get in return. And by the way, the church is not innocent of this. I've seen people, I've experienced people. They would like to give to the church as long as they can seem to have some sort of influence and power in the church. I've had a long history to be like, no, that does not impress me as much as you think that it might impress me. But there's commas, Josh. I saw the comma. It's a nice comma. But that doesn't impress me. If you're giving money in exchange to get power and influence, you're not generous. You're a lobbyist, right? That's what we call lobbyists. And then the last thing we see here then is that generosity is more holistic than specific. They gave of themselves first to the Lord and then to Paul. It's interesting because some people think, oh, they'll use that passage to say that they gave to, basically they tied to the church first and then they gave to Paul, but that's not what the text says. The text says they gave of themselves. This idea that they submitted themselves to God and then they submitted themselves to Paul and his authority. This idea that generosity is more holistic than it is specific. What I have found with the most generous people that I know is that they're generous in pretty much every area of their life. I've met people that want to use power and control for money, is that they'll give here, but they will not give anywhere else. The most generous people that I know, they give it of it all. They're generous with it all. It's not like they're generous with their time, but not their money. Generous with their money, but not their energy. I go, no, the most generous people I know that you know are generous with everything. Why? Because generosity is far more often holistic. It's this whole thing than it is specific. And so we see this with the church. He goes on then in 6 and 7. Accordingly, we urge Titus that as he has started, that he so also complete among you this act of grace, referring to the offering to the church in Jerusalem. But as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all earnestness, and in your love for you, and our love for you, see that you excel in this act of grace also. And so what Paul is saying is, he's saying, I want to use this church in Macedonia to encourage the church in Corinth to do what? To give. And he said, I want to encourage you in this. You've excelled in lots of areas. You've excelled in your speech. You've excelled in your knowledge. You've excelled in your faith. But I want you to excel in this as well. Now, truth be told, the church in Corinth, they would have really valued excelling in their knowledge. Oh, man, you guys are so smart. Yeah, we are. We excel in that. They would have found great value and excelling in their speech. They would have found great value in excelling in their faith. And so Paul says, man, you guys excel in all of these things, and yet I'm telling you this other thing, do not fail to excel in generosity. That actually generosity is a sign of your spiritual maturity. It's interesting because so often people are like, you should give to be faithful, you should give to be faithful, you should give to be faithful. I go, that's true. Maybe give to be faithful. But those that are spiritually mature become increasingly generous. And spoiler alert, as we're going to get to next week, it's because we follow a Jesus that gave it all. As he goes on later in the passage, which I'll preach next week, but because we follow a Jesus that went from riches to rags. And that's the same journey that we take. That's the spiritual journey. It's interesting because I'll hear people talk about, like, how do you want to grow spiritually? How do you want to grow spiritually? Or how do you think you would grow spiritually? And they'll say things like, oh, I need to read my Bible more. I need to pray more. And they may even say, I need to give to the church more, but that's not generosity in that sense. I need to know more about the Bible, those sorts of things. I need to trust God more. I go, but rarely do you hear somebody say, I need to grow in generosity. God, would you teach me? Would you grow me in generosity? And that's actually, as we spend 5 weeks in this, that's one of the things I want you to be praying, God, would you help me grow in generosity? God, would you help me be proactive with the needs around my life? Would you help me give extravagantly? Would you help me be eager to give? Would you show me a world beyond my own needs? And what I want is I want God to cultivate in you generosity. By the way, as we enter into a world that is increasingly transactional, one of the great ways that we can be countercultural is to be generous. In a world that does everything to claw, scratch, lie, cheat, and steal to get more of those resources, we are the kind of people that are looking to part with them. May we be generous people. And maybe one of your prayers over the next 5 weeks is just that. God, would you cultivate that in me? There's a great danger, what Paul is talking about here, there's a great danger to increase in the other areas of spiritual maturity, but to not grow in the area of generosity. May we excel in our knowledge. May we excel in our faith. May we excel in our speech. But may we also excel in our generosity. And may we be known individually and collectively as a church that does so. Man, may we as a people step into a world that is so transactional and be beacons of generosity. That's my prayer. Let's pray. God, we thank you for your goodness. We thank you that you are generous to us. I pray that you would cultivate in us not just a giving spirit, but a generous one. May we be people of generosity in a world that maybe is growing cold and transactional, that is looking to lie, cheat, and steal to get all they can for those they love. May we be different. We thank you that you are a generous God. That we expect you to be a generous God. We expect you to be a God that gives. And so may we be cultivated and crafted and grown and matured into people of generosity. And that in that generosity that you would be glorified. That we would not just be people who give, but that we would be beacons of generosity in a dark culture. We love you. We pray for these things in your name. Amen.